In recent years, as China has been gradually realizing its 9-line claim, a number of scholars have voiced direct criticism against it. The 9-line has also been picked as a topic for discussion in many conferences and workshops on the South China Sea issue. Lawyers, experts and researchers all agree that the 9-line has absolutely no legal basis and constitutes a violation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982.
Under international law, the 9-line has no real standing. I think most experts on both international law and other maritime affairs believe that China's assertion of this 9-law cannot be justified in light of UNCLOS, especially the rights of coastal states for 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone. Well, the 9-line certainly is a threat to the rights of the coastal countries because under the UN Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, every coastal state has a right to a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. And in the case of China's 9-line and its neighbors, that line cuts deeply into the coastal economic zones or exclusive economic zones of almost all of its maritime neighbors.
I think that this 9-line is very far from international law. You see, somehow, I think in China, they see the map and they take a pencil and they make this 9-line, and that's all, because it's not based on international law, on history, on current political situation, on relation, on sea. I think it's a will of some people. They say maybe this great 80% of South China Sea or East Sea, you see, will be our. So they take a pencil, make this 9-line and say, so it's our territory, and that's all.
This is the most arguable part of the Chinese claim in the South China Sea, is whether their claim, which is very vague to historic rights or historic title, gives them any greater rights than they would under the juridical provisions of UNCLOS. Again, is of no legal value, because historic rights today really have been overtaken by the express UNCLOS provisions.
Many international scholars have also plainly pointed out the ambiguity and lack of transparency of the 9-line claim in the South China Sea.
Well, the 9-line is of very weak legal validity for a number of reasons. One is that it hasn't really been defined. The coordinates need to be clearly defined for China to make a claim. A second reason is that it's very arbitrary. Why do the 9-line, why do the lines go in one particular area and not elsewhere? We are not clear about that. So really it is an arbitrarily drawn line.
The 9-line that is being asserted by China is a unilateral line that China has drawn across the maps. It is not supported by any coordinates. It has deliberately been left ambiguous to serve China's interests at a particular portion of time. And in this direction, I would also like to assert that China does not believe in geographical boundaries. It keeps on asserting historical boundaries and strategic boundaries. So 9-line falls more into the historical and strategic needs that China wants for overall control of South China Sea.
The Asian Journal of International Law, Issue 1, 2012, published an article entitled Dots and Lines in the South China Sea, Insights from the Law of the Map of Evidence, written by Professor Eric Franks and Marco Benatar from the Centre for International Law, Vrije Universiteit, Brussels, Belgium. The article provides an in-depth analysis concerning the irrationality of the 9-line, in particular the inconsistency, lack of precise legend and specific purposes, and especially the technical inaccuracy of the maps denoting the 9-dash line. Based on that analysis, the two writers concluded that the 9-dash line has no solid basis under international law. The criterion of discernible intent on the part of the People's Republic of China's government is not adequately fulfilled. The variety of interpretations of the U-line offered by legal scholars, as well as the People's Republic of China's ambiguous note verbale de dato, 7th of May 2009, bear witness to this conclusion. Besides confusing sentence structures, terms employed in the note verbale, namely relevant waters and adjacent waters, are particularly puzzling as they do not appear anywhere in UNCLOS.
Yeah, it's a very difficult claim to substantiate with respect to modern contemporary international law. And especially the problem is that nobody exactly knows what the content of the claim is. The only thing that China did was attach the map to a document that they submitted to the United Nations. And this has been an important trigger for the international community, because it was only then that China apparently on the international level wanted to make use of that claim. And so it's very important, I think, for China to clarify what they really mean, because as long as you don't clarify the real intention of the line, it puts other states in a very difficult position because they don't know what exactly they have to understand.
Under international law, I find it very difficult to without further clarification by Beijing, to find any true validity to the claim. There's been no attempt or no consistent attempt to provide some justification based on exclusive economic zones, based on whether it extends from islands that they allegedly claim. So at this point it seems that someone has just arbitrarily drawn a line that has no validity under international law.
The American Journal of International Law, Issue 1, 2013, published an article entitled A Legal Analysis of China's Historic Rights Claim in the South China Sea by Pierre-Marie Dupuis, Professor of Public International Law, University of Paris. The article provides various arguments to prove the ambiguity of the 9-dash line claim, and notes that in the context of the ongoing indeterminate geographical scope of China's maritime claim in the South China Sea, the production of the 9-dash line map in 2009 was perhaps an attempt to clarify the scope of that claim. However, far from providing helpful additional information, the map has cast additional doubts as to the geographical scope and legal justification of the claim. The major problem here is that China's claim is very ambiguous. Thus, it is hard for us to determine its nature and connotation. It is certain that this claim is a territorial claim, firstly, and then it is a maritime claim. With respect to its scope, it covers most of the South China Sea. Therefore, the question here is how this claim is consistent with other coastal states' rights. According to international law, we can neither rely on a judgment of political nature nor a claim with historic term. It is true that China has been a superpower in the region for thousands of years. However, other regional countries are also entitled to certain maritime space, as defined by the international law of the sea, which is now codified in UNCLOS, resulting from over 10 years of negotiation. Countries in the region, such as China, the Philippines, and Vietnam, are parties to UNCLOS. Thus, UNCLOS is the law applicable to those countries. Even Chinese and Taiwanese scholars also have to admit the lack of transparency in the 9-dash line claim of China. Professor Dustin Quang Xiang Huang, Director, Institute of Political Science, National Taiwan University, observes,
But basically, I would just to say that there are a lot of misunderstanding about the U-shaped lines. First, I would like to say it is not the boundary line. If it is the boundary line, then it should be in one continuous line, but not the 11 dashed lines. And secondly, the water inside definitely is not the internal waters. If it is the internal waters, then nobody can enjoy the freedom of navigation within that the waters within the U-shaped lines. And the second and third, it is definitely is not the outer limit of the exclusive economic zone, and not to mention it is the limit of the continental shelf. Just because that U-shaped line was publicized in 1947. At that time, there was no such idea of the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, probably.
And in 1947, we've seen that map by the Kuomintang government and published the U-shaped line map that caused a lot of attention to the regional countries and also external countries.
International scholars hold that the 9-dash line claim entails a risk to peace, stability, freedom and safety of navigation in the South China Sea and results in tensions in the area.
Well, currently the impact on peace and stability is quite significant. It's a source of the most important tensions in Southeast Asia. In the longer term, it's also important to freedom of navigation issues.
I think it can only do it in a negative way, in the sense that the other countries do not know exactly what China wants. And so when you are able to fish with your vessels in a particular area, and the next day you have a Coast Guard vessel of China coming and stop you, and you don't know exactly why they are doing it, it's a very unsecure situation which is created, and it can give rise to a lot of tension in the area, which I think is not really necessary.
It has not been constructive, the way that China has handled this issue, to have published that line, and in conjunction, if we look at also the actions of China, it's somewhat increasingly assertive behaviour over the last couple of years. This has, I think, created an element of instability, created an element of distrust between from a number of countries, and this extends. The damage is quite significant for China's soft diplomacy or soft power, because the mistrust or distrust extends not just to certain claimant states, but also to other neighbouring countries to the region, such as my own country, Australia.
The 9-dash line is, because of its ambiguity and its obvious violation of accepted international law, both the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and customary international law, I would characterize as a threat to the overall regional order in Asia. It's clearly perceived as a threat to the other Southeast Asian claimants, largely because they view it as a sign that if China's unwilling to follow international law in this area, where else is China unwilling to follow international law? While to a casual observer, it's just a few rocks and banks in the ocean. I think to ASEAN claimants, as well as the U.S. and many other outside powers, it's a statement about what kind of nation, what kind of great power China wants to be in the 21st century. And what we're seeing right now is that it wants to be one that only follows international law when that meets its interests, and is willing to ignore international law when it doesn't. That's clearly not a recipe for stability.
The big problem is that most Chinese think that everything inside that line belongs to them. And this is, of course, very provocative for all the other countries around the South China Sea. And unfortunately, this thought or this misunderstanding is also there in the Chinese services. So the Chinese maritime surveillance vessels, the Chinese Navy and other agencies are trying to exert jurisdiction in areas that obviously belong to the continental shelf and exclusive economic zone of other countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei and the Philippines.
Professor Carlyle Taylor from the Australian Defence Force Academy indicated that the 9-dash line of China is not consistent with conventional map drawing techniques. One fundamental principle of international law is that the land dominates the sea, which means that a country that has the sovereignty over a land territory may claim the entitlement to that territory's exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. For instance, Vietnam may claim 200 nautical miles based on Vietnam's mainland coast. However, with respect to China's circumstances, I don't know the basis on which they claim their 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Currently, under international law, a small island has no effect and cannot be used to make claim to an exclusive economic zone and a continental shelf. However, China is claiming a very broad expanse of water measured from those small islands and submerged banks. This is unacceptable under international law. The 9-dash line of China is not consistent with the standards of international map drawing techniques. Professor Marvin Ott from Johns Hopkins University said, "China has made a sovereignty claim which is inconsistent with international law. Thus, they cannot provide any specific figure or lawful evidence to back their claim. Their claim is unfounded, and they know it. By its 9-dash line, China is claiming its sovereignty over most of the South China Sea, which no country in the world could support. The United States does not support it, neither do India, the European Union, Australia, nor Japan. No country supports this claim of China." Dr. Thomas Yandel, lecturer at the American University in Washington, D.C., held that, by the 9-dash line, China wants to make an undisputed area disputed, and once a dispute exists, China will consider it a reason to defend its core interest. China's claim to sovereignty over this area is baseless because it is very far from China and China does not have historical evidence. The international workshop themed Prospects of Cooperation and Convergence of the Issues and Dynamics in the South China Sea, held in Jakarta, Indonesia, included on 31st of May 2011 with the Jakarta Statement. The statement is confirmed that China's claim of sovereignty over the territorial water based on the 9-dash line map was not consistent with international law and criticized by the international community. The 9-dash line topic also heated discussions at the second international workshop on the South China Sea held in Ho Chi Minh City in 2011. Mr. Daniel Schaefer from France's 21st Asia Research Center said that the publishing of the 9-dash line by China has been the most remarkable event of the past 2 years. In his opinion, China should make public and clarify its intent and discuss any arisen differences with other countries in the region. If the talks on dispute settlement among the countries achieve no progress, the possibility of bringing the regional dispute before the International Court of Justice or the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea should be taken into consideration.
With China, we need to give up the any idea that the 9-dotted line should represent anything else than an indication of a claim to islands. China needs to do this because it needs regional stability so it can continue in economic development and also keep internally stable.
At the workshop on South China Sea maritime security held by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C. on 2012, Senator Joe Lieberman, chairman of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, observed,
"If these claims are not settled in a peaceful way under international law, that what we worry about, of course, is that if they're settled through bullying or coercion, to be as blunt as I can be."
Professor Peter Dutton, strategic researcher, China Maritime Studies Institute, U.S. Naval War College, held that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, UNCLOS, states that a country's claim of its jurisdiction over resources should be based on the geographical features of its coastline. China's claim of jurisdiction within the U-shaped line, or the 9-dash line, without mentioning, even indirectly, the geographical features of its coastline or its baseline, is a fundamental violation of international law. Mr. Dutton also stressed that the 9-dash line is one of the two main sources of tension in the South China Sea. On the 16th of October 2012, the workshop themed The South China Sea, a New Conflict Zone, was organized by the Institute of International Relations and Strategy, IRIS, and the Gabrielle Perry Foundation, which is a prestigious research organization specializing in politics. The workshop attracted a large number of leading experts in international law of the sea and international geopolitics from France and Europe. The reports delivered by participants at the workshop affirmed that the 9-dash line has no legal basis. Agreeing with other legal experts at the workshop upon the inconsistent attitude of China before the international community and in the field of law, Professor David Scott from Brunel University, UK, said, "When China circulated the maps printing the 9-dash line at the United Nations, it wanted the waters encompassed by the line to be officially recognized and legitimate. Yet, at the same time, China refused to give technical evidence to support the map, refused to comply with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, and did not wish to settle the dispute with its neighboring countries before any international legal institution." Mrs. Monique Chamillier-Gendreau, Professor of Public International Law and Political Science at the University of Paris 7, Denise Diderot, former President of the Association of European Jurists, concluded that it is important to have the consent of other countries so that a right could be lawful. If there were no such consent, then it could not be said that China is lawfully entitled to the 9-dash line. On the 7th of March 2013, the Subcommittee on Security and Defence of the European Parliament held a public hearing on the South China Sea for the first time. Speaking at the hearing, Mrs. Teresa Fallon, a researcher from the European Institute for Asia Studies, emphasized that the 9-dash line, making up approximately 80% of the South China Sea, was complicating the situation. At the workshop themed South China Sea, Central to Asia-Pacific Peace and Security, held by the Center on Asia and Globalization of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Singapore, and the Asia Society, USA, in New York from the 13th to 15th of March 2013, the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Christopher Hill, said that the 9-dash line claim made the South China Sea a private lake belonging to China. China itself is the troublemaker in the South China Sea. Also at the workshop, international scholars asked China to explain its 9-dash line claim. The paper entitled The 9-dash Line in the South China Sea, History, Status and Implications, written by Mr. Gao Zhiguo, Chinese judge at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and Mr. Xia Bingbing, Professor of Law of Tsinghua University, and published in the American Journal of International Law, Volume 107, Number 1, January 2013, was circulated at the conference. At the 5th International Workshop on the South China Sea held in Hanoi in November 2013, Mr. Pierre-Marie Dupuy, Professor of Public International Law at the University of Paris, delivered a report refuting the arguments in the article by Mr. Gao Zhiguo and Mr. Xia Bingbing. Professor Dupuy concluded that the evidence provided in the article demonstrates the ambiguity of the 9-dash line and even makes it confusing.
For a legal claim, 1947 to the present, UNCLOS finally was ratified in 1992. So it came before international law, before there were exclusive economic zones. And China keeps saying there's international law in addition to UNCLOS, but they have never told us what it is. And we heard today that historic rights are not a basis for this. They're inland bays and other special features. So it has no international legal basis in law. It's just a declaration of China's that they prefer to keep very ambiguous.
Well, I think anybody who has seriously investigated this issue knows that 9-dotted line, the so-called cow's tongue, is completely illegitimate. It has zero basis in international law, and it was created by a Taiwanese bureaucrat in 1947, and it was then adopted some years later by the mainland's government, but it has absolutely no legal basis, and It's an outrageous claim, 750,000 square miles. And so it's really, although it's the center point of China's policies with respect to the Southeast Asian Sea, it has no legal basis.
I'm a bit circumspect about the legal validity of the 9 dashed lines because it claims almost 80% of the entire South China Seas, and hence I don't think it is, and I've talked to many experts who have been tracking from the legal point of view, I don't think it can stand too much to legal scrutiny. Having said that, I find that this sort of a claim is in a bit exaggerated because you see, on one hand you have the Chinese who like to claim that in Indian Ocean, through which their slugs come, their energy slugs come through the Indian Ocean, they are extremely worried about the freedom of navigation, while they are claiming 80% of the South China Seas, which is a paradox, because then what happens to the freedom of navigation and slugs for the users in that area? So this is a paradox which I think only the Chinese can sort of relate to, and we find it very surprising. Yes, from the Indian perspective, we are quite concerned about this 9 dashed lines. The reason is very simple. We have about 50% of our trade to this region going through the area. What happens to the freedom of navigation there? In addition, India, as I had stated earlier, has invested heavily in mineral resources and exploiting mineral resources legitimately.
On the 6th of May 2013, a conference on legal aspects of territorial disputes in the South China Sea was held by the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., with the participation of numerous scholars, researchers, legal experts, and respected jurists in the world. With the theme Islands or Rocks and Territorial Disputes in the South China Sea, American scholars focused on analyzing the legal aspects of territorial disputes in this sea area. They held that the 9 dash line of China was the most complicating factor in resolving the legal disputes, as it had no legal basis under international law.
Indeed, I would argue that the presentation of the Chinese claim is stronger without the 9 dotted line, because everyone that knows law of the sea knows the 9 dotted line is preposterous, and I'll use that term. And therefore, all it does is weaken it, because it looks as though China is making a claim based on that, as opposed to the kinds of focused sovereignty issues on individual features, for example, that it may have a very good case in relation to those. So I think it's in everyone's interest to get rid of the 9 dash line, which is not consistent with modern oceans law, and in my judgment, not consistent with the national interest of China.
On the 5th and 6th of June 2013, a workshop themed Tension Management in the South China Sea was held by the Center for International and Strategic Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C., with 250 participants, including leading scholars and researchers of the South China Sea studies from the U.S., China, India, Japan, Europe, the Philippines, Taiwan, China, and Vietnam. Once again, the 9 dash line claim was opened up for discussion. Most of the participants agreed that the 9 dash line claim had absolutely no legal basis and constituted a serious violation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982. Moreover, China's unilateral encroachment upon what belonged to other claimants in the South China Sea posed a challenge to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982.
Well, the 9 dash line in itself has no legal basis in international law as a China to claim jurisdiction over the waters in the South China Sea. So if the 9-dash line is related to a jurisdictional claim over the water space, then that is not supported by international law, as has been very clear both from international tribunals and all countries concerned. The only way to claim jurisdiction over water space is through geography. And so China, in order to articulate a claim to jurisdiction over the water space in the South China Sea, has to do that based on geography and not on the 9-dash line or history or power. Right? It's got to be based on geography and international law of the sea.
Mrs. Bonnie Glasser, Senior Advisor on Asia of the Center of International and Strategic Studies, U.S., observed that the concerned countries should bring the South China Sea dispute to an international court.
But in my view, that would be the best way. And then, of course, to rely on the courts that exist through UNCLOS in order to address the maritime disputes. But the first step that I think must be taken is to clarify the claims that all the countries have. I think that China's 9-dash line is not defensible based on international law, although I'm not an international lawyer. And so I think that clarifying that claim, what that 9-dash line is, and defending it from the perspective of international law is important. So I think certainly clarifying the claims and then ensuring that the baselines that countries have in fact drawn are also in accordance with international law. So that would be a very good beginning. To then proceeding to the discussion of how to actually resolve them.
Under the circumstance where China was stepping up enforcement activities to realize its 9-dash line claim on the 22nd of January 2013, the Philippines officially initiated an arbitral proceedings against China before the Arbitral Tribunal under Part 11, Section 2, Annex 8 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982. The prevailing view demonstrated in the Statement of Claims of the Philippines is that the rights of every coastal state should be defined in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982, and those rights should be respected by other states, in particular China. The submission of the Philippines includes 13 specific claims, of which the most important is refuting the irrational 9-dash line claim. The Philippines request a decision by the Arbitral Tribunal which states that the 9-dash line claim violates the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea 1982 and is invalid. Although China has raised objections and refused to participate in the Philippines arbitration, the proceedings will proceed in conformity with relevant provisions of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982. The Arbitral Tribunal for the Philippines arbitration was established with 5 arbitrators. The president is Mr. Thomas Mensah, who is of Ghanaian nationality and the former president of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. The Arbitral Tribunal has been officially working. The arbitrators appointed to rule the Philippines arbitration are regarded as prestigious and experienced lawyers. They are the former judges of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, ITLOS, with many years of practice. Thus, the judgment of the tribunal is considered reliable. The whole world is waiting for an impartial judgment from the tribunal on the irrationality of the 9-dash line claim in the South China Sea. Based on international law, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a qualitative judgment of the Arbitral Tribunal would be the basis for maintaining peace, stability, and ensuring freedom and safety of navigation in the South China Sea, living up to the expectations of the international community. At the Conference on Legal Aspects of Territorial Disputes in the South China Sea, held by Stimson Center, U.S., in Washington, D.C., on the 6th of May 2013, Professor John Norton Moore, Director of the Center for Oceans Law and Policy, University of Virginia, observed,
"The 9-dotted line is also something, it seems to me, as we keep putting this out there, that really is tactically and strategically not in the interest of China. We have just seen that the Philippines were able, in fact, to leverage that 9-dotted line in terms of an action brought against it under UNCLOS. It would be difficult to leverage most other things, but the 9-dotted line, to be frank, has absolutely no basis in international law and oceans law. It is completely defenseless. It is not something that is going to aid China, and what it has done is subject them, I think, to a strategic defeat by the fact that this arbitration, in fact, could have been filed against them on it. And it's not in the interest of China in so many different ways.
Many international experts have voiced their support for resorting to legal means in order to resolve the dispute in the South China Sea.
No, it's saying we want you to rule on whether the 9-dash line and also certain maritime areas that China is trying to determine based on these reefs and rocks and whatnot, are they consistent with UNCLOS? And this is a case where, and I'm getting too far into the panel's expertise now, but this is a case where the treaty the tribunal goes ahead without China's participation, and China can't, in theory anyway, at least not officially, or formally can stop it.
It really does infringe on the exclusive economic zones and other claims of competing countries. And so I think it is quite ambitious, and I'm hoping that maybe the UN court, the UN tribunal that's dealing with the Philippines proposal will rule on this and give us some legal rulings that make it clearer exactly what China can claim and what it can't claim.
I think it's crucial. It's the first attempt to really force China to make a decision on whether or not it's willing to abide by international law in this dispute or not. There is concern, I think fairly, that it could, if the decision backs China into a corner, then Beijing will react by simply ignoring it and possibly pulling out of the law of the sea. But just as likely, I believe, is that China will decide, if a ruling comes out that's not in its interest, it will decide that it loses more in credibility on the international stage by ignoring it. And even if all it does is have a court rule the 9-dash line legal, that in itself is a small victory. It will force China to clarify its claims, and that is to the benefit of the entire region.
Yeah. This arbitration that is ongoing is potentially very important. And I hope that the arbitral tribunal will find that at least some of the requests from the Philippines are within its jurisdiction, so that we will get a legal interpretation of the status of reefs and rocks and islands in the South China Sea. I think this is also in China's interest, because if this is clarified, then it becomes easier for China to redefine its U-shaped line as meaning only a claim to islands and their zones.
Okay, thank you. I think that is one of the most significant developments in the South China Sea dispute in recent years. I think that the Philippines, it was a good decision by the Philippines to do so. Now, of course, we don't know what the outcome of this case will be. But if the arbitral tribunal rules that the 9-dash line is not compatible with UNCLOS, then I think that represents an important legal and a moral victory for the Philippines. And I think then there will be a lot more pressure on China to actually clarify what it's claiming and also to justify it under existing international law.
At a conference on the South China Sea held by the Center for International and Strategic Studies in June 2013, many participants voiced strong support for bringing the South China Sea dispute before international legal institutions. Acting Assistant Secretary of State Zhou Yun said that the concerned parties should settle the dispute by peaceful means, such as diplomatic negotiation, mediation with the support of a third party, or international arbitration. Professor Peter Dutton stressed that it is neither history nor force, but international law which should be used to settle the differences in the South China Sea. The most significant power of a provision or of an international treaty is setting standards and outlining expected behaviors. The 9-dash line claim has been criticized by the international community and considered the cause of tension and complication in the South China Sea, threatening the freedom and safety of navigation in the area.
We have a situation where you have international law, UN conventions and other laws ruling the relationship between the countries, and you have the Chinese popping in with a claim, a 9-dash claim, which is quite disturbing because it's nobody knows on which legal base it's been produced. The rationale and the background of it is unclear. The Chinese have not been specific, and the interpretation that is made by the international community is that China, even from the Chinese side, the rationale and the claims are unclear, and there's no consensus in China about what the purpose and the real objective is of the 9-dashes are. And we see it as maybe a sovereignty claim, but on what it relies is a bit unclear. So clearly, the consequence is it's a difficult way to deal with it, because when you have a clear statement and you know what the rationale, the base, you can argue and discuss. Here you have no ground to discuss because you don't know what the questions are and what the objectives are. So, but the clear consequences short term and now is that it puzzles a bit the international community. So it weakens the relationship in the region, it triggers a lot of tension, and the claims on seas which are on the region, and seas and economical interests which are becoming disputed where they should not be disputed if there were application of the law.
I'm more and more of the opinion that the 9-dash line is really the crux of the problem in the South China Sea. And I say that because it seems to me it stands in the way both of a resolution of the dispute and joint development. China's position is that sovereignty of the islands is non-negotiable, it's indisputable in China's words. That means that that's a really insurmountable barrier to negotiations on sovereignty of the islands. I also think that it hinders the prospect of joint development because some countries like the Philippines and Vietnam have said that joint development can only take place in truly disputed areas. And we don't know what's truly disputed until China clarifies what it's claiming, which it hasn't really done yet. So I think if we're to move forward with cooperation and conflict management and eventually resolution in the South China Sea, then the 9-dash line really stands in the way of that.
On the 5th of February 2014, at the hearing of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the U.S. House of Representatives, Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Russell directly criticized the 9-dash line claim of China in the South China Sea. There is a growing concern that this pattern of behavior in the South China Sea reflects an incremental effort by China to assert control over the area contained in the so-called 9-dash line. Despite the objections of its neighbors, and despite the lack of any explanation or apparent basis under international law regarding the scope of the claim itself, China's lack of clarity with regard to its South China Sea claims has created uncertainty, insecurity, and instability in the region. It limits the prospect for achieving a mutually agreeable resolution or equitable joint development arrangements among the claimants. I want to reinforce the point that under international law, maritime claims in the South China Sea must be derived from land features. Any use of the 9-dash line by China to claim maritime rights not based on claimed land features would be inconsistent with international law. The international community would welcome China to clarify or adjust its 9-dash line claim to bring it in accordance with the international law of the sea. The 9-dash line claim has been condemned by the international community. As a responsible superpower and a party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, China should give up their irrational claim and clarify their claims in the light of international law, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982. Vietnam possesses full legal basis, historical evidence, and practical management to affirm its sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction over its waters as established in accordance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, the international treaties to which Vietnam is a party, and legal documents of Vietnam. Vietnam will apply every peaceful means that is appropriate and necessary to defend its sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction, as well as other national lawful and legitimate interests of Vietnam in the South China Sea, in accordance with the UN Charter, international law, and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982. In his speech at the opening ceremony of the 12th Shangri-La Dialogue on the 31st of May 2013, Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyen Thanh Dung transmitted a clear message on Vietnam's policies on the issues in the South China Sea. Vietnam perseveres in the principle of peaceful dispute settlement on the basis of international law, whilst respecting the independence, sovereignty, and the legitimate interests of the nations involved. All parties concerned need to exercise self-restraint and must not resort to force or threat to use force. Once again, Vietnam reiterates its consistent compliance with the ASEAN 6-point statement on the South China Sea and will do its utmost to work together with ASEAN and China to strictly observe the DOC and soon arrive at the COC. As a coastal state, Vietnam reaffirms and defends its legitimate rights and interests in accordance with international law, especially the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982.